everyone. It's really, really good to be here. Incredible energy in the room. Can I just get a show of hands? Who in this room is a teacher who teaches English? You are the life givers of our community. My mother says hi, and a sincere and heartfelt thank you for giving her the keys to this, incredibly wonderful new world. When my mother first came to Australia, one of her biggest challenges was, how do you learn the language to be able to communicate and speak to people? And so one of the few things she recalls is the lady who taught her English. You remember the person who teaches you English. And she was this tall, brown-haired woman whose name was Helen. And that's the story of how I got my name. So anyway, I'm here to talk about Generation 2.0. I grew up in a very interesting era. This is the era where I saw the rise of the internet, the proliferation of the mobile phone, and the emergence of the Green Movement. So a lot of stuff was happening in my lifetime. And all this occurred in the turbulence of puberty. And I, along with many of the teenagers of my day, whether they were Vietnamese or Chinese or white or Indian or Sudanese, we were all asking the same question at that point in our life: who am I? And the thing is, it's funny, we form our identity by wearing a particular brand of clothing, maybe driving a particular kind of car, living in a particular kind of house, speaking in a particular way. The thing is, when you have a refugee background and you're Vietnamese, or the colour of your skin makes you different, then it's not something that you can shed. It's not a part of you that you can grow out of, take off when you get sick of it. It's an indelible, permanent, all-encompassing part of who you are. And as a 15-year-old, you don't know what to do with that. I grew up watching Chinese kung fu movies with my grandmother. And for a long time, that constituted my entire understanding of what it meant to be Vietnamese. And, a lot of the conversations which take place amongst the Generation 1.0 and 1.5 centre around this process of settlement. How do you settle in? I think what defines my era is this sense of unsettlement. So we were brought up here, we were raised here, some of us were born here, but there was this almost a sense of latent unease that there was something more to who we are and that we couldn't find the answer in an immediate way. And it's not that something that you can go and talk to your parents about. And I think this transcends culture. I think it does. I think, whether you're Australian, whether you're born here, this is like, how do you communicate your teenage angst to your parents? And when your parents have gone through the boat experience, which is defined by sacrifice and pain and struggle, how do you explain to them the crisis of identity? It's like they bring on the quote that was read before. It sort of appears in the context of, your mum coming out and saying, here's the might of our sacrifice. The least that you can do is your trigonometry homework. So you do your trigonometry homework. Do you know what I mean? So it's very, very hard to explain to our parents. Now, I remember starting school. And back then, I remember very little, and I assumed that everyone spoke Chinese. So it was a cultural shock turning up and not being able to speak to people. And I didn't really understand the concept of a cultural shock back then. I just sort of carried on happily as a very young kid. Anyway, my mum really wanted me to fit in, so hence I got the name Helen. And she said, I came home to her one day and I said, Mum, they have this incredible thing they do at school where if it's your birthday, you bring in lollies and then you give the lollies out to the class, or you bring a cake in, they sing happy birthday, and then everyone looks at you and then you're, really accepted. So my mum's like, yes, I really want to help you fit in. So, I'll do anything I need to make sure that, this is as easy for you as possible, and I want to make you happy. So she went out and bought me a durian cake. Now, many Asian cuisines have been wholeheartedly embraced by the Australian community. Your spring rolls, your sweet and sour pork, honey chicken. Durian is not one of those things. And then from that day on, I came home and I said, right, Mum, it's my responsibility to be the cultural manager the cultural mediator in our household. And so from a very young age, you think, it's your responsibility to somehow balance these two worlds. And sometimes, I know that the settlement experience is often associated with a lot of, struggle, but it's actually quite, in hindsight anyway, it's quite a, idiosyncratic, it's quite a funny period of your life. And it's, one of the things that came with being the cultural mediator in the household was being Mrs. Tram when the telemarketer calls. So we get a call saying, "Can I speak to Mrs. Tram?" And I don't know why, but I always thought if I put on a deeper man voice, I would sound more like my mum. So we're like, "Oh, can I speak to Mrs. Tram, please?" "Yes, Mrs. Tram speaking." And somehow we got through. But I made a conscious commitment to go to my mum and try to explain to her. And I think this is the decision I made that I think a lot of people in my position didn't have the fortune of sort of having access to being able to do that, because my mother was quite understanding. So I have to try and help my mum explain what it's like to grow up in Australia. I will make a conscious commitment to give her a sense of my world. And the next opportunity came up at the school athletics, and I was selected to represent the school as second emergency. So basically, if 4 people got injured, I got the honour of representing my school in the shot put. And as it happened that day, 4 people did get injured, or they were... And so I was representing my school, and I'd never held a shot put before, but I gave it my best shot. I thought you just sort of swing around it a couple of times and throw it. And then I actually did really, really well. Like, I threw it like 2 meters or something. And the teacher came down to me, and he put his hand on his knees, and he slapped my back, and he says, "Good job, son." And so I went home that day, and I said, "Mum, I don't think the bowl haircut is fashionably acceptable." But, they were good times. You learn how to mediate the cultural and the language divide in a number of ways. And my grandma did this really, really well. My grandmother, her best friend was this old Italian man. Is anyone Italian in this room? My grandmother's best friend was this old Italian man who lived next door, and neither of them could speak a word of English. But I would come home, I remember going through the side gate, and they'd be talking, in this really immersed conversation. And I'd peek through the gate, and then my grandma, she's quite a plump lady, and she was very vibrant, big smile, and she was going, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah," in Chinese. And he'd be like, he'd have his head popping over the fence, and he'd be like, in Italian. And somehow it got through to each other, and then they'd talk, yeah, 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 and then they'd swap vegetables. Cross-cultural communication can happen. You don't even need language. And that's what I learned. I grew up eating Italian spaghetti. That's what she called it in Chinese. Italian noodles. And next door they were eating Chinese spaghetti. Cross-cultural communication can happen. The one difficult thing is the expression of "I love you," which when it was said before, something sort of moved inside my gut. I thought, yeah, I never say "I love you" to my mum. And she never says it to me. It doesn't mean that she doesn't love me, but I think when you grow up here, you look for love in Western ways, and you express it by writing a nice card, like sending her a nice Hallmark card on Mother's Day, or saying "I love you." Vietnamese mothers do not say "I love you." They will cook you a really, really big meal and then get really vindictive if you don't eat everything. And that's "I love you." My grandmother definitely didn't say "I love you." She didn't even hug. But I remember reading this book at school. This was prep again. And my teacher read this book about how wonderful it was to get hugs from grandmother. Hugs from grandmother were like honey. It was warm and it was big. And maybe some of you, give, hugs if you have grandchildren, and you remember getting hugs from your grandparents. It was just a wonderful feeling. And I never had that. And so I thought, I'm going to give that a go. And so I went home that day. And my grandmother was in the kitchen cooking Italian Chinese spaghetti, and I thought, I want to make my move. And so I just took 3 strides across the room. I threw my hands around her waist, and she just froze. And then she turned around, and she's like, "Don't do that." And so I stopped. So I left. So that was my last attempt to hug my grandmother, but the love was always there. And so I think the biggest lesson you learn growing up is that you can express language and your ideas and your love in so many different ways. and that if you have the desire to connect to other people, then the avenues are always there. And that was a gift that I received being in an environment where I had a lot of loving family members. But the settlement, the sense of unsettlement, I might sort of end with this point. The sense of unsettlement really never got reconciled until that year where I went to Vietnam. And for a really long time growing up, you know, your biggest preoccupation is to keep your iPod updated. You know, I grew up in the era of the Spice Girls. You know, this was the 90s, right? And you don't notice at the forefront of your imagination that, you know, being Vietnamese or being Chinese, Vietnamese or Australian, and somehow this meant something to you. And then I went to Vietnam, and for a long time it was this sort of mysterious spectre, this big country where my family came from, where my mother grew up, where this refugee thing happened, but I didn't know what the country looked like. And because a lot of my mother's photo albums, these days we don't keep photo albums anymore, we sort of upload 1,000 photos on Facebook of us getting smashed over the weekend or whatever, but we don't keep photo albums. They're not things that you pass on to your grandchildren and 10 generations later that's still there. But the photo albums that my mother had like about 5 photos, all black and white, and they were so precious. And so I imagined Vietnam was black and white. In my head, Vietnam was this black and white country. And I came there, and you know, when it's green in Vietnam, I don't know if you've been to Vietnam before, but when it's green in Vietnam, it is really green. It is this vibrant emerald green that I've never seen before. And I thought, there's something that's shifting inside me, and that I can find my answer here. I went to the countryside where my grandparents were, and I hadn't seen my grandparents for 18 years. And this was after the war, this was after the separation, and then they thought, I saw my grandmother, and on my dad's side, and she was this very frail, tiny old woman, and she says, Helen, come with me. When she first saw me, and I'm like, she's my grandmother, I've never met her before, I don't know how to relate to her. She's like, come with me. She took me into this room at the back of the little hut in the village. And you can hear the chicken crowing outside and the pigs oinking in the shed, and like, what is it? She pulls out this piece of cotton wool. She peels it apart. And she's like, look at this. And I said, what is it? And she's like, it's your umbilical cord. I didn't know how to react. I was like, a part of me was like, this is kind of disgusting. She kept it for 30 years. But another part of me was like, wow, I always thought there was a part of me in Vietnam somehow, and I didn't know up to this point that she literally. Yeah. There was a piece of my umbilical cord kept by my grandmother in Vietnam. And I walked away from Vietnam, and I think the realization for me was that there was a part of me, literally or figuratively, still connected to Vietnam. That even though I never sort of was raised here, you know, it's home is Australia. You know, I come to Vietnam, I hear an Australian accent, and it's like, wow, where do you come from? They're like, Melbourne. I'm like, wow, I'm from Yarraville. You're from Collingwood. That's amazing. You know, that's the connection that I feel. But anyway, so that's the realization I had, that there was a part of me still connected to this country, and that, you know, in order to find who you are, it's not a conflict between, you know, the heart and the liver and the stomach, that all these organs are a part of you and they work in harmony. And once you realize that, then you find the peace to go on and do other things which you're really passionate about. So anyway, the writing project, Self-Portrait, I'll be offering the books later if anyone wants to get a copy. But, you know, it's a realization that the refugee experience is not one of pain and suffering, but it's also one of triumph and hope and humanity and discovery and idiosyncrasy. It's a really funny experience as well. And you get people talking about bringing, you know, my friend brought home a white boyfriend, you know, bringing her to Vietnamese mother, your white boyfriend, you know, like, and she told the whole experience, and this story was, you know, this is who we are, and this is a piece of history, and this is where we've come from and where we are. And so anyway, thank you for sharing with me your time. This video is a prelude to a broader film project that I'll be working on, but it's also a prelude to the book, which I think is captured in the essence of what we want to do with this media project. Thank you.